Hey everybody, welcome back to wellnesstalks.org. I'm your host, Todd Schmenk, and I'm here with Dr. Mark Forman, somebody I have been working with and relating to for the last 2 or 3 years. He provides psychotherapy in San Jose and throughout California online. He's also the founder and lead trainer of the Certified Integral Psychotherapist Global Training Program and actively teaches and supervises both therapists and coaches interested in directly applying integral theory. Does that sound like a fair summary, Mark?
Yes, it was, and I'm very happy to be here, Todd.
Glad to have you. So, we talked a little bit about this like last week, and I just wanted to let everybody know about you have written another book, not just one, but this is your second book. You want to tell us a little bit about that and the title and the monster's journey?
Sure, yeah, the title is The Monster's Journey from Trauma to Connection. And the focus of this book is really about people who have suffered childhood trauma and what they need to do and what they need to understand in order to grow and heal and in some ways overcome the impacts of the early trauma. And the reason it's called the monster's journey is that I use a bit of a framework that was put together by a famous researcher in mythology. His name was Joseph Campbell. And Campbell came up with this idea called the hero's journey. And just to briefly talk about that, the hero's journey describes the path of change for most people. And we see this hero's journey form in stories and movies. Almost all of the great works of art have this hero's journey story within it. And that's the story of living in a very normal environment and then being confronted with what they call a call to adventure.
Right.
Something happens that pulls you out of your everyday environment, and then you go into a world that's mysterious and are initiated into that world. And then go ahead, Todd.
It's the entryway of how my book starts. I'm doing the hero,
Mm-hmm.
which is why when you came out with this, and you're doing the other side of the coin, so to speak. But it's Odysseus, it's Luke in Star Wars, it's Diana in Wonder Woman. I mean, it's the whole something happens and it changes your world.
Yes. And for your book, Team Positive, it would be you wake up and go to the doctors and get a cancer diagnosis, and all of a sudden you're thrust into a whole new phase of life.
Right.
You don't know what it's going to be like.
Or now you wake up and you can't smell, and you are now on the COVID journey.
Yes. So heroes' journeys are often can be quite scary, so they can start off in that way. They can also start off in a more positive way. You get a new job, or you meet a new partner, or
we tend to focus on the negative, but you're right. It could be I want you a winning lottery ticket.
Yes, exactly. So what I worked on in the book was just the idea that the hero's journey is a very powerful and useful framework, but that I didn't think that it worked quite as well or fit quite as well if you had undergone early trauma. And that was mostly because if you have early trauma, you're confronted with feelings and emotions at a very, very early age. and you don't really have time to mature and get ready for the hero's journeys that you might take. So most hero journey stories happen to teenagers, young adults, sometimes to older children,
Right.
but they don't happen to little children because little children can't play the role of the protagonist in a story with the hero arc. They're not really ready yet.
And you're saying, so like Piaget's developmental components or schema, when schemas are developed, one tends to get developed even stronger than normal, and they don't even have the capacity, I believe that that's been pointed out as well, to take another perspective until what, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. They necessarily can't flip into the other role and understand that this is happening to me. They make it all about me, and then it gets locked away, and that's what this book is addressing, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. So the child experiences the pain of abuse or neglect or abandonment,
Or knowing
or
that you're gay at 4, and what do you do with it?
yes, and then maybe bullying and things that would come along with that.
Or you're just different.
Yep. Or you're just different in some way that sets you apart and ends up being painful to you in your childhood, and that changes your level of trust in the world and in yourself. Typically is how it goes.
And
So
you have personal components that you've brought into this book as well. I mean, your own monster's journey is like right there on the pages, right?
yes. So for me, just briefly, my monster's journey started when I was 2 or 3, when my father became psychotic, which means in the technical sense, he was losing touch with reality in a very specific way. He thought he was the Messiah of the world, like in a religious sense, he was going to save the world with his ideas and teachings, and in doing that, he cut himself off from his family, both myself and my brother, my mother, but also his siblings and parents, and sort of went down this rabbit hole of psychosis and paranoia and such. And so it was a very frightening experience for me as a child, because this was my father, and it culminated with him leaving the country and abandoning me, essentially, and my brother. And so that was a period where I feel that all kinds of things were going wrong within me. I blamed myself. I didn't know how to do anything better or wiser. And it changed. It changed me. And took me on this monster's journey, because now I was going to have trouble with normal life, just doing things other people do and take for granted.
So, schema of abandonment, schema of defectiveness. There must be something wrong with me, because if I was good, this never would have happened. He never would have left me. All that first person perspective, right?
Yes, absolutely. All of that negative evaluation of myself.
And we all have this, I would imagine, to some greater or lesser extent, right?
I'm sorry, say that again?
That we all would have this to some greater or lesser extent.
Yes, I think, most of us have some negative inner critic that we must grapple with. The argument in the book, and there's some research to support this, is that people with different types of childhood trauma probably have a more intensified version of the inner critic that other people have, which is often not easy not easy in any case to deal with.
Right. Well,
But
that's why you use ACE to measure, to kind of get an idea of, is this something you should even, you need or should consider?
yes. So we use what's called adverse childhood experiences.
Right.
This is a checklist that's been used in the field for now about 20 years and to do research. And it's basically a checklist of the events in your early life that most often would lead to having trauma. And you go through the checklist and you see how many boxes you check. And the research suggests that the more boxes, so if you have physical abuse and sexual abuse, that is more impactful than only having physical abuse, even though obviously both are very serious. So it's that having several of these ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, makes us more and more vulnerable to having physical health issues as well as mental health issues when we are older. So there's a dose response relationship. The higher the dose of childhood negative experiences,
Right.
the higher the response we see later in life.
And I would imagine then this ties down to like personality disorders, borderlines becoming a thing the more doses you had before a certain age. I mean, isn't that like 1 to 4 that typically? I know there's a neurological component that they think as well, but you're already predisposed, and then bam, you have 4 ACEs. You have 4 different situations along the way. Or am I interpreting that right?
Yes, my understanding of the research is that excuse me, that ACEs make people more vulnerable to having a diagnosis of a personality disorder. Borderline personality disorder is the most connected to the number of ACEs.
But then anxiety, depression, all those things, they're all tied to, it's a spectrum, and we're talking about one end. So
yes. And so one argument that people make is that borderline personality disorder is less of a personality disorder and more of a response to trauma. And I think in certain cases that is really true for certain clients. It's indistinguishable from their traumatic childhood. Now, people are complex, and there are other people with borderline personality disorder who don't have the childhood trauma.
Right. They had a perfect family and they still ended up that way.
Yeah, and and that can be for other reasons, other events, or just genetics has a little bit to do with everything.
I say that we're speaking the 4 quadrants. There's always that genetic physical component that can just put a monkey wrench in the whole thing, right?
Yes. And the genetics might work in the positive way too, in that some people who have a lot of childhood experiences which are negative have this quality we psychologists call resilience.
Right.
And somehow they have these experiences but don't have these negative outcomes, and that's an interesting thing to know.
Yeah, so like Big 5 personality trait assessment, maybe I score lower on the agreeableness scale, and so I don't take it personally.
Yes.
Lower on the neuroticism score, and it doesn't bother me.
Yes. So personality characteristics can be protective, right, but also there's probably a social support component. So some evidence that if a child has a really healthy adult, just one,
right,
around them during some critical periods of growing up.
And it doesn't even have to be a parent. It could be a neighbor or an aunt, or a teacher.
Coach, uncle, anybody, that they will be able to weather the storm of their teenage years more easily. And then maybe not end up in quite the same place as someone with childhood trauma, which is unsupported.
So I'm just curious though, who would benefit the most from this book? I mean, who were you thinking about when you wrote this book?
I was very much thinking about a client or a patient, whatever word we would use, who might be really struggling with mental health symptoms, depression, anxiety, attention deficit disorder to a certain extent,
Really?
maybe bipolar, and if a person has had multiple diagnoses and they're wondering what's going on, the book is an offering to say, okay, let's talk about this piece of childhood and let's see if you fit or resonate more with this monster's journey theme. Did you have a sense that everything was bleak starting pretty young? Did you have a mother or father or somebody who was mentally ill in the family? Were you hurt or beaten? And if so, there's this other path of healing that's going to make a lot more sense to you than the modes of healing that are more typically offered to people. So the book is for people who might be struggling, who think they might have some trauma, and who want to dive into what that means factually, but also in a way the lessons that stories can teach us. Because stories are the way that a culture passes on its knowledge.
So it's also what Keegan's pointed out. It's a fantastic way to bypass that immunity to change, that our automatic defense system. So I love that you're using the stories. That's fantastic.
Yes.
Now I would like to back up just a second. I'm going to pause you there because you said ADD. So I'm trying to think about, okay, so somebody who's ADHD or ADD when they're a kid, I think what you're saying there is there's higher probability of scoring an ACE, high ACE, because they don't follow like everybody else do. They don't pay attention. The teachers come down on them. You're stupid. You're this. You're that. So I think that's to just make this very real for the average person that's also listening to this or wants to read this book. How would this benefit them? That's fantastic, because a lot of people do struggle with, do I have this? And whether I do or don't, this book might be a different way into that, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes, very much. And the way you described that was very accurate. So imagine, you're living in this traumatizing situation in your home, and typically about 80% of the time, it's really the parents who are involved in what's happening. So as sad as that is, they're the ones perpetrating the situation. Well, even if that situation is the parent is a drug addict, and that creates chaos in the home.
Right. So you're talking about an actual
trying to hurt the child, but they are.
Or the
so then you go to school, and you're full of emotional reactions and feelings. People want you to do these activities that don't seem to help. So you're distracted, you don't care, you're off in dreamland, maybe, thinking of some other world you would want to live in. And that can look a bit like ADD or ADHD if you're a little more impulsive. And so what often happens is the symptoms get diagnosed, but not always the sort of causes or the pathway. And so this is a book that really wants to talk about, how do you know that you've been traumatized? How can we get this to be a pretty objective conversation.
I was just
You know,
about to ask. It sounds like you're like integral or like psychotherapy does in general, is try to pull something out of that subjective place, objective, so you can observe it, you can see it, and then come to terms with it, integrate
yes,
it, and move on.
yes, yes, absolutely. Yeah, that may involve family members and things. I just yesterday I had a conversation with one of my uncles who had read the book and wanted to share with me more about what happened during the time of my father's psychosis, and some of which I knew and some of which I didn't know. And so I walked to, it was not an easy conversation to have, but I left with knowing a lot more about that time and what happened. And, you know, I've found that the more I can learn, the better my ability to cope with the trauma and its reactions. And that's sometimes what we do is we connect with older, trusted family members who are able to shed some light
Hmm.
on what happened, and we, you know, receive some healing from that knowledge. So it's a book that encourages people to take steps, methodical steps.
Yeah, I noticed that in the last section, it was try this, consider this, ponder this.
Yes, very
And
much
so
so.
this book stands alone. You don't have to go to therapy to use this book.
No,
I mean, obviously,
although,
it would work well with, therapy as well, but
yeah, it definitely can function as a self-help book.
right.
However, it makes a big suggestion that we do need to find a healer, or maybe more than one. And a healer in this definition is just somebody who is going to listen to you, see the best in you, not judge you. So, what the famous therapist Carl Rogers would call unconditional positive regard. And that for a trauma survivor to have a person see them down in the depths, sort of below the layers of the traumatic defenses that we develop,
Right.
that is really powerful, because you want to get in touch with the parts of you that maybe weren't hurt by the trauma but are just kind of buried underneath sadness or anger. So the healer and meeting the healer is this key phase. Now, that healer doesn't have to be a therapist. It could be could be a sibling, it could be a relative,
A
it could
rabbi, a priest, a monk, a religious figure.
yes, anybody who fulfills that role.
It's safe space, right? Gives you that
Yeah,
safe space, non-judgmental, and just sits with you.
yeah, and you know, cares about you as a person. So
That's lovely.
yeah,
It's a really lovely goal.
yeah, yeah. And I believe it's possible. When we look, you know, there's a little seek and ye shall find in the book, I think. So
Well, it's nice to see a story which complements the hero. That was the first thing that really struck me pretty hard. And then you got to tell us a little bit about the story of where the cover came from, because that was pretty interesting as well. So it's kind of like an incarnation.
yes, very much so. So when I had been in other types of therapy and they were very helpful, but I was still having reactions that I didn't really understand to relationship situations or other kinds of big changes. They would really throw me off. In the language we would use, they would say they really triggered me
Right.
into sort of a bad situation. So I ended up in trauma therapy. So specific, my therapist was a trauma therapist. And I began to learn more about trauma through the therapy. But the image that came up to my mind, was of like felt like a troll sitting under a bridge somewhere near a village of normal people, but there was a tension there. The villagers didn't like the troll. The troll didn't particularly like the villagers. And so the image on the front cover of the book is sort of one artistic rendering of a troll under a bridge, looking very quite sad and despondent, which was certainly an element of how I felt at the time, and sort of gives a nice visual representation of the beginning of the journey. The troll has already been transformed, is no longer in this group of quote unquote normal beings, but there's a possibility, and the bridge is one kind of symbol.
Got it. Yeah.
If you think about it,
Yeah, no, that's great.
that moves or talks about bridging to other aspects in life.
Well, you're making me think of Rudolph, the land of misfit toys, like where everybody that didn't
Yes.
in one place all kind of finds each other, and in a way, it's the internet has helped the land of toys, people to relate to each other in very specific niches. So, but like I said, I knew that the cover story or the cover art had gone through a couple different phases, and there was a lot of thought behind it. And I thought anybody listening should know that. Mm-hmm. So if you could just say, like in one, to sum up the book, like the one thing you really hope that somebody could get from this book, what would that be?
Mm-hmm. I think the most important thing would be self-understanding and self-compassion. So the idea that the struggles that a person might be having because of childhood trauma, they make sense and are understandable, and there's a way forward, in as much as it might feel like there isn't. No, there actually is a path, and we know something about the path from both clinical work, but also the stories tell us quite a lot about how humans overcome these kinds of challenges. So
we have to hold it lightly and move through. It's not going to be the most comfortable journey, but once we get through, it's not that far off from the hero's journey. It's just a different route. You both arrive, it sounds like, at the same place, right?
Arrive at slightly different places, I guess I would say. The hero, the hero is
knocked down and then works his way back, his or her way back up, where this was down from the start.
Yeah, and so the goal of the hero's journey is this sort of initiation into the magical, you could say spiritual aspects of life.
Okay.
And the goal of the monster is to be able to live in the normal world and engage and have a healthy life that incorporates all the things they might have missed when they were really suffering from their trauma.
So
now, of course, yes. And now, of course, a traumatized person can then explore the magical and mystical dimensions of life. So they don't have to skip the hero's journey altogether, but they do have to do this separate healing journey in the childhood trauma. So I would characterize the monster as doing something extra.
Got it. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off again.
No worries.
I also try to pay attention to time so that we don't.
Yes, absolutely.
Right. So, but it sounds like a lot of people could absolutely benefit from this, whether it was more, whether they had 5 ACE, lots of trauma, things that were way outside of their control, or even just smaller things. Because even if you're on the hero's quest, I would imagine having this extra manual here of how to accept the within. I mean, because a lot of times that's like one of the flaws you see with heroes is they get caught by this the monster side of themselves that they never really fully embrace. Mm-hmm. So I think in some of the more unique stories where you can see them both, like I think Luke Skywalker, or actually not Luke, Darth Vader, he's the monster. And he started off on one path, got taken off, and all the trauma that happened there, and eventually was able to reintegrate both, which I think would be pretty phenomenal.
So there are sort of what you might call the black belt move, which is integrating both of them. I tried to stay away from that in the book, just to keep things a little more digestible. But
one quest at a time, huh?
Yeah. Yes, there's lots more to say about the monster's journey, and there's a lot more to say about how it relates to the hero's journey.
And vice versa. So I just jumped to a conclusion there. I was like, oh, hey, wait a minute. So
no.
How wonderful. And put it into a story that most people are familiar with, Star Wars and that whole saga, which I believe Campbell was a huge fan of, Joseph Campbell.
Yeah, he actually directly influenced. He knew George Lucas personally.
Oh, all right.
And so Star Wars was literally written with Campbell's ideas of the hero's journey in mind. So
did that affect Tolkien as well, or is it Tolkien actually? I know that all the Lord of the Rings stuff affected Lucas. So
Tolkien, I think, wrote and conceptualized a lot of his stuff before Joseph Campbell chronologically, but
Campbell, I used to think highly of that work. He saw that as a modern myth.
Yeah, I mean, it was terrific, and Tolkien was working with European and English and Irish, I think, mythologies,
right,
and updating them, and they were heroic mythologies, and so it was natural that the Lord of the Rings would turn into such a hero's journey. I love it. It's easily my favorite movie.
Well, I'm glad that we could end this interview by completely geeking out so that people can see that we're just human, that psychologists and mental health counselors are just human like everybody else. So
yeah, exactly.
That's a great way to end this, and I thank you so much for being on this part of the show. I hope to have you back again.
It was totally my pleasure, Todd. Thank you.